There, do you see him? He's walking on water. That's not Papa. I'm telling you that him. And everything on this street just shut down.
I commanded oil tankers through the most dangerous waters in the world for the Iranian regime. But the night Jesus stepped onto my bridge at the Strait of Hormuz, everything I believed about God was destroyed in an instant. I have carried this secret for 3 years. What happened that night was not a dream. My crew saw it too. And today, for the first time, I am going to tell the whole world exactly what happened in those waters. My name is Faris Al-Zahrani. I am a Saudi Arabian ship captain, and for over 2 decades, I sailed oil tankers through the Persian Gulf under agreements that served the interests of men whose names the world should fear. There is something about the ocean that changes a man, not softens him, changes him. When you spend enough years commanding a vessel through waters where one wrong decision kills 30 men, you stop being the person your mother raised. You become something harder, something colder, something that makes decisions without flinching, because flinching gets people killed. I was born in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on the western coast of the country, in a city that has always lived between the desert and the sea. Jeddah is a port city. It breathes shipping and trade and commerce the way other cities breathe ordinary air. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water was the smell of my childhood. The sound of ship horns in the early morning was my alarm clock before I was old enough to go to school. My father, Nasser Al-Zahrani, was a harbor master at the port of Jeddah for 30 years. He was not a wealthy man by the standards of Saudi Arabia, where oil money had made millionaires out of ordinary people with the right connections. But he was a respected man. The port workers called him Abu Faris, the father of Faris, even before I was born, because they knew that whatever son a man like Nasser raised would be worth knowing. My father was strict and disciplined in the way that men of his generation were strict and disciplined. He woke before sunrise every morning to pray. He fasted during Ramadan without complaint. He never missed Friday prayers at the mosque. He gave generously to the poor from a salary that was never as large as it should have been. He was, by every measurement I understood at the time, a righteous man, a faithful servant of Allah, a man walking the straight path. He taught me that the sea was a gift from God and that sailing, it was a form of worship. He used to take me to the harbor on weekends when I was very small and lift me up onto the dock so I could see the massive cargo ships and tankers sitting in the water like floating cities. He would point at them and tell me that men who commanded those ships were doing something important, something that mattered. He told me that one day, if I worked hard and stayed faithful, I could be one of those men. I believed him with everything in me. From the time I was 8 years old, I had one goal in my life. I was going to become a ship captain. I studied hard in school because my father told me that sailors who could not read charts and calculate navigation would drown themselves and their crews. I studied mathematics and physics and geography with a focus that my classmates found strange. Most of the boys I grew up with wanted to work in the oil industry or the government or go into business. The sea held no romance for them. It was just something that sat at the edge of the city and got in the way of travel. But for me, the sea was everything. When I was 19, I enrolled in the King Abdulaziz University Maritime Program in Jeddah. It was one of the most competitive programs in the country. My father had to call in every professional favor he had ever accumulated to get me a place in the admissions process. When I was accepted, he stood in the doorway of my bedroom and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was pride so large and so genuine that it had nowhere to go except out through his eyes. He said only 4 words. He said, "Don't waste this, son." I did not waste it. I graduated near the top of my class. I earned my Officer of the Watch certification before I was 23. I completed my Master Mariner certification before I was 28. By the time I was 30, I was commanding vessels in the Persian Gulf. By the time I was 35, I was being recruited by shipping companies whose names appeared on the hulls of the largest oil tankers in the world. I was exactly the man my father had told me I could become. I wore my uniform with the gold stripes on the shoulders, and I stood on the bridge of my vessel and I looked out at the water. And I felt like I was exactly where God had placed me on this earth. But I had not yet learned that a man can be exactly where he is supposed to be and still be walking directly into the darkest chapter of his life. The turn came when I was 38 years old. I had been working for a mid-sized Saudi shipping company for several years, running cargo and crude oil through standard commercial routes in the Gulf. The work was good and the pay was decent. But I was approached by a man named Walid Sabhan, who represented a private consortium of investors that operated tankers under multiple flags across the Gulf region. Walid was smooth in the way that dangerous men are always smooth. He wore expensive clothes and spoke in a calm, measured voice, and always made you feel like he was doing you a personal favor by choosing to speak with you at all. He took me to dinner at a restaurant in Jeddah that cost more for one meal than what my father had earned in a week. He ordered without looking at the menu and talked about my career with the easy confidence of someone who had read every page of my professional file before sitting down across from me. He told me that his consortium had identified me as one of the most skilled captains operating in the Gulf. He told me that they had routes that required a captain of my abilities and my discretion. He'd said that last word deliberately, discretion. He held it in the air between us for a moment before continuing. He told me that the routes in question passed through sensitive zones. He told me that the cargo being transported was not always the kind of cargo that appeared on the official manifests. He told me that the financial compensation for this kind of work was 3 times what I was currently earning. 3 times. I should have stood up from that table and walked out of the restaurant and never looked back. I should have gone home and called my father and told him about this conversation and listened to whatever he said. My father would have told me to stay away from men like Walid Sabhan. My father would have recognized immediately what kind of operation was being described. But my father had passed away 2 years earlier from a heart condition that had gone undetected for too long. And I was sitting alone at an expensive table in a restaurant I could not afford, being offered 3 times my salary. And there was no one in my life at that moment whose voice was loud enough to compete with the number Walid had just put in front of me. I told him I was interested. The routes that Walid's consortium operated were not illegal in any simple sense. They existed in the gray space that international maritime law has never fully illuminated. We transported crude oil for customers whose identity was kept deliberately obscure. We passed through the Strait of Hormuz on schedules that did not appear in standard maritime databases. We used flag of convenience registrations that changed frequently and made tracking the vessels difficult for international observers. I understood enough about what we were doing to know that we were helping certain parties move oil revenues that were supposed to be blocked by international sanctions. I did not know all the details. I told myself that not knowing the details was acceptable. I told myself that I was just the captain. I drove the ship. Other people made the arrangements. Other people decided whose money we were carrying and where it was going. My job was to get the vessel from point A to point B safely and to ask as few questions as possible. This is what a man tells himself when he knows he is doing something wrong but is not willing to stop. Within 2 years of working for Walid's consortium, I had made more money than in my entire previous career combined. I bought a large apartment in Dubai that overlooked the marina. I drove a car that cost more than my father had earned in 10 years of working at the port. I sent generous amounts of money to my mother and my sisters in Jeddah every month and felt good about myself for doing it, as though generosity to family could balance out the compromises I was making in my professional life. I prayed 5 times a day. I observed Ramadan. I performed Hajj once during those years. I told myself that I was a faithful Muslim who happened to work in a complicated industry. I told myself that God saw my heart and knew that I was not a bad man. I told myself that the money I was making would allow me to eventually leave this work and do something clean, something honest. I would retire early. I would give to charity. I would make up for whatever gray areas I had operated in. I was very good at telling myself these things. The consortium's operations became more openly tied to Iranian interests over the following years. The customers whose oil we transported were increasingly connected to Iranian state entities operating through front companies in the UAE and Oman. The financial arrangements ran through networks that I eventually understood were designed specifically to evade American and European sanctions on Iranian oil exports. I was helping Iran sell oil to buyers who were not supposed to be buying it. I was one of many small pieces in a large machine that was generating billions of dollars for a regime that used that money for purposes I tried very hard not to think about. Every time I saw news about Iranian proxy groups causing violence somewhere in the region, I switched the channels. Every time I read about sanctions being imposed specifically to prevent the kind of trade I was facilitating, I put the newspaper down. I was not a terrorist. I told myself this constantly. I was not funding bombs or weapons. I was just a ship captain doing his job in complicated international waters. The money my voyages generated went into large, invisible pools of revenue, and what happened to it after that was not my concern or my responsibility, but somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I refused to look directly at. I knew that this was a lie. I knew that the money flowed somewhere. I knew that sanctions existed for specific reasons. I knew that the regime I was helping to enrich had a long and documented history of what it did with the money it accumulated. And I kept sailing anyway. That is the nature of the compromise a man makes with his conscience. It does not happen all at once. It happens in small steps, each one so small that you can barely notice it. Until one day you look back and realize you are standing somewhere you would have found unthinkable when you started the journey. By the time I was in my mid-40s, I had been sailing for the consortium for nearly 8 years. I was commanding a large crude oil tanker called the Gulf Crescent. My crew of 32 men came from 8 different countries. Some were Saudi, some were Egyptian, some were Pakistani, and some were from Southeast Asia. They were skilled professionals and good men, men with families waiting for them at home, men who trusted me with their lives every time we left port. That trust was the one thing I never took lightly. Whatever else I had compromised in those years, I was always a good captain. I was always honest with my crew about conditions and risks. I always put the safety of my men above everything else. This was the one area of my life where I felt I could still stand up straight and say without hesitation that I was doing the right thing. I could not have known that the one night I would need that commitment most was coming toward me, like a wave I could not yet see on the horizon. It began as a routine transit. We had loaded crude oil at a terminal in the Gulf, and were scheduled to pass through the Strait of Hormuz heading east into the Arabian Sea. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically sensitive waterways in the world. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide, and through those 21 miles passes roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply every single day. Sailing through Hormuz is never truly routine. The strait sits between Iran and Oman, and the waters are among the most politically charged on earth. Iranian naval vessels patrol the area regularly. There have been incidents over the years involving the seizure of tankers, but the harassment of commercial vessels, and the standoffs between Iranian forces and vessels from Western countries. Every captain who transits Hormuz knows that the rules of ordinary maritime navigation apply, but that other forces are also present in those waters that do not follow published rule books. The night we transited was in late autumn. The weather forecast had been clear when we left port. Light winds, good visibility, calm sea state. The kind of conditions that make experienced sailors relax slightly more than they probably should. The straight transit would take several hours, and then we would be in open water with a long voyage ahead. I was on the bridge as we entered the strait. My first officer, a man named Hassan, who had sailed with me for 4 years, was standing at the chart table reviewing our course. The helmsman was at the wheel. The radar was running clearly, showing us the positions of other vessels in the strait and the coastlines on either side. Everything was operating exactly as it should. Then at approximately 2 in the morning, everything stopped. The radar screen went dark. Not flickering, not distorted, simply dark. The navigation systems, both primary and backup, simultaneously lost signal. The engine telegraph, which communicates speed orders from the bridge to the engine room, stopped responding. The radio went to static on every channel. The lights on the bridge remained on, but every electronic instrument we depended on for safe navigation through those narrow waters went silent at the exact same moment. In 30 years of sailing, I had never experienced a total simultaneous failure of multiple independent systems. These systems are designed with separate power supplies and independent backups precisely so that this kind of total blackout cannot happen. A ship like the Gulf Crescent has layers of redundancy built into every critical system. The likelihood of everything failing at once is, by engineering calculation, essentially zero. But there we were, in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz, in the dark, with 32 men depending on me, and nothing working. Hassan looked at me from across the bridge. His face was calm, in the way that experienced sailors force their faces to be calm when everything inside them is not calm at all. He said, "Captain, what do we do?" I told him to get the engine room on the intercom and find out if they still had propulsion. The intercom still worked because it ran on a separate hardwired system. The engineer reported that propulsion was available, but that they had also lost most of their electronic monitoring systems. We had power, we had engines, but we had no navigation, no radar, no radio communication, and no way to determine the position or movement of the other vessels that we knew were sharing these waters with us. A loaded crude oil tanker cannot stop in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel is too large and the currents in the strait are too strong. Stopping would leave us at the mercy of the water and the other traffic without any way to communicate or navigate. We had to keep moving, but moving blind through one of the most congested and politically dangerous waterways in the world was itself a kind of controlled catastrophe. I made the decision to maintain course and reduce speed. I sent crew members to the bow and the stern with handheld lights to serve as manual lookouts. I ordered the ship's horn to be sounded at regular intervals, according to international collision regulation protocols for vessels with limited maneuverability. I instructed Hassan to use the hardwired intercom to coordinate every department and keep information flowing across the ship. I was doing everything a captain is trained to do in a situation like this. I was working through the problem methodically. I was keeping my voice steady because a captain's voice is an instrument that either calms a crew or sends them into panic. I was doing my job, but I was terrified, not for myself. I want to be honest about this. The fear I felt in those moments was not about my own survival. It was about the 32 men who were on that ship because they trusted me. Hassan with his 4 daughters in Alexandria, the young Filipino engineer who had told me on the voyage out that his wife was pregnant with their first child, the Egyptian cook who had been sailing since he was 17 and who had spent 40 years at sea so that his children could go to university and never have to work on ships themselves. These men had come to sea to earn a living. They had not signed up for this. Whatever compromises I had made in my career, whatever gray areas I had operated in, these men had nothing to do with any of that. They were innocent. They were my responsibility. We moved through the darkness for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 20 minutes. The lookouts on the bow reported seeing lights in the water but could not confirm what vessels they belonged to or how far away they were. The currents were pushing us off our last known heading. Without radar or navigation instruments, I was steering by memory and by whatever stars I could see through patches in the cloud cover above us. Then, one of my crew, a young Saudi man named Bilal, who was on his 3rd voyage, came running onto the bridge. He was breathing hard and his face had an expression I have never seen on a sailor's face before or since. Not fear, something beyond fear, something closer to what I can only describe as awe. He said, "Captain, "There is a man standing on the bow." I told him there were lookouts stationed on the bow. I told him he was seeing the lookouts. He shook his head. He said, "No, Captain. This is not one of our men. This man is standing at the very front, at the point. He is not holding anything. He is not wearing a life jacket or a uniform. He is just standing there. And the water around the bow is lit up, not from the ship lights, from him." I looked at Hassan. Hassan looked at me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I left the bridge. I walked forward through the ship, through the main deck, moving toward the bow. The night air was thick and the darkness was almost complete, except for what light remained from the stars. As I moved toward the front of the vessel, I began to see it. There was light at the bow, a concentrated, steady, white light that was coming from a figure standing at the very tip of the ship, not the scattered amber of our working lights or the cold blue of a flashlight. This was something else entirely. A warm, clear, contained light that illuminated the water immediately around the bow in a way I could not explain by any understanding of physics or optics that I possessed. The man was standing at the bow with his back partially toward me. He was dressed in white, not a crew uniform, not a life jacket. White robes that should have been whipping in the wind but were not moving at all. The water in front of the bow, which should have been dark and invisible, was lit up in a radius of perhaps 50 feet forward, enough that I could see the surface of the sea and the shapes of any obstacles that might be in our path. I stopped walking. My legs stopped working the same way they stop working in a dream when you try to run but cannot. The figure turned toward me. I cannot tell you exactly what I saw in those seconds. My mind was not built to contain what was standing at the bow of my ship in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz at 2 in the morning with all our instruments dead. I can tell you what I felt. I can tell you that the moment he turned toward me, I knew with absolute certainty who I was looking at. Not because I recognized his face from a picture. I had grown up in a household where pictures of Jesus were not displayed. Not because I had been dreaming about this. I had not. I knew because of what came off him in waves. There is no other way to say it. Something was radiating from this figure that was not heat and not light and not any physical force that I have a name for. It was more like truth. Concentrated and pure and so overwhelming that standing in it felt like being stripped down to the exact center of who you really are. Every lie I had ever told, every compromise I had ever made, every morning I had switched off the news and I tried not to think about where the money went. All of it was visible. All of it was exposed. And in that state of total exposure, I was not destroyed. I was simply seen. He spoke my name. He said, "Faris." Just that, one word, my name. But the way he said it contained something I cannot put into language. He said my name the way you say the name of someone you have known since before they were born. He said my name the way you say it when you have been watching someone walk toward a cliff for a long time and they are finally close enough to reach. Then he said, "I kept them safe tonight. Not because of what you deserved, because of what I am. I went to my knees on the deck of my own ship. I, Faris al-Zahrani, a man who had commanded vessels through some of the most dangerous waters in the world for 30 years. I went to my knees the way a child goes to his knees, because there was nothing else to do in the presence of what was standing before me. He looked at me with eyes that held something I had never seen in any human face. Not judgment, not the cold assessment of a man who has reviewed your record and found it wanting, something else. Something that made the judgment entirely beside the point. He looked at me the way you look at someone you love who has been very sick for a very long time, with grief and with relief, and with a tenderness that cuts deeper than anger ever could. He said, "I know what you have been carrying. I know what this work has cost you. I know what you told yourself every time you did not ask where the money was going." He showed me things then, not with words, with something closer to understanding, direct and sudden and impossible to look away from. He showed me a family in Beirut displaced by a conflict funded partly by the revenues our voyages had helped to generate. He showed me a young man in Yemen, my age in the image, sitting in the ruins of something that used to be a house. He showed me the face of my own father in the harbor at Jeddah, lifting a small boy up to see the ships, telling that boy that a man who commanded one of those ships was doing something that mattered. What would Nasser al-Zahrani say if he could see what his son had been doing for the past 8 years? The grief that came with that question was the most physical sensation I have ever felt that was not physical at all. It moved through me like the shockwave from an explosion. And I understood in that moment with a clarity that no amount of prayer or preaching had ever given me that what I had been doing was wrong, not complicated, not gray, wrong. He said, Faris, I did not come here to condemn you. I came here because you are still worth reaching. He stretched his hand toward me, and I saw in the light that surrounded him the marks on his wrist, scars, old and permanent and real. And I understood what those scars meant. I had been raised in Islam, where the cross is denied and the crucifixion is disputed. But standing on the bow of the Gulf Crescent in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz with my instruments dead and 32 men behind me, I understood those scars the way you understand something that was always true, but that you had been looking away from. He died. He died specifically. He died for men like me. Men who moved through their lives, telling themselves small, comfortable lies and looking away from consequences. And he died so that the debt of all those lies and all that looking away could be settled by someone other than me. I took his hand. The warmth that went through me in that moment was not temperature. It was something that went all the way to the center of whatever I am made of. It was as if every hard, cold, closed thing inside me was cracked open at once. Not broken, opened. Like a fist that has been clenched for so long that the fingers have forgotten how to lie flat. I wept on the bow of my ship in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. I, Faris al-Zahrani, who had not wept since my father's funeral, wept like a man who has been holding something for far too long and has finally been told that he is allowed to put it down. Then the light began to withdraw, slowly, like a dawn running on reverse. And as it went, I heard his voice one more time, close and clear, as if he was still standing next to me. He said, "Go back, keep them safe, and then tell the truth." I do not know how long I knelt on the deck. By the time I stood up and walked back toward the bridge, the sky to the east was beginning to lighten. The early gray of pre-dawn was replacing the blackness of the night. And when I stepped back onto the bridge, every instrument on the ship was working. The radar was running. The navigation system had reacquired its signal. The engine telegraph was responding normally. The radio was live on all channels. Every system that had gone dead simultaneously was now operating as though nothing had ever happened. Hassan looked at me when I came back onto the bridge. He looked at my face and then looked away quickly, the way a man looks away when he sees something in another person's expression that he is not sure how to respond to. He said quietly that all systems had come back online approximately 3 minutes ago. He said we were on course. He said no other vessels appeared to have come close to us during the period when our instruments were down. I said, thank God. And for the first time in many years, I meant those words exactly and completely, without any of the automatic habit that religious phrases collect over decades of repetition. Bilal was on the bridge too. He was standing near the back wall with his arms folded, looking at me with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who has seen something extraordinary and is trying to decide whether anyone will believe him if he talks about it. He caught my eye and I gave him the smallest nod. He closed his eyes briefly and then opened them and looked out at the water. We did not speak about it that morning. The transit completed without further incident. We cleared the strait as the sun came up and entered the open water of the Arabian Sea. I handed the watch to Hassan and went to my cabin and sat on the edge of my bunk with my hands on my knees and stared at the wall for a long time. What do you do with what I had just experienced? What category do you put it in? I was a man who had prayed 5 times a day for most of my adult life. I was not a man who dismissed the supernatural, but I was also a man with 30 years of experience on the water. A man who had learned to evaluate information carefully and to separate what was real from what a frightened mind conjures in stressful situations. I went through every rational explanation I could think of. System failures causing disorientation and hallucination. Sleep deprivation affecting my perception. Stress from the situation creating a kind of waking dream. I went through every one of these possibilities with the same methodical care I would use to diagnose a mechanical fault on my vessel. None of them held together. Bilal had seen the figure. Bilal was 24 years old and had been awake at that point for 11 hours, no more. He had no history of psychological episodes. He had seen the light and the figure before I had, independently, and had come to get me before I had gone to the bow myself. His account matched what I had seen. And the instruments, 32 independent electronic systems on separate power supplies with independent backup circuits, do not fail simultaneously and then restore simultaneously. That is not a malfunction. That is something else. The days that followed the transit were the strangest of my professional life. I was the captain of a functioning vessel on a routine voyage. I did my job. I held my watch. I reviewed charts and weather forecasts and communicated with the company on schedule. From the outside, everything was normal. But inside, I was being dismantled and rebuilt at the same time. Every assumption I had built my adult life on was under pressure. I had been raised to believe that Islam was the final and complete revelation of God. I had been taught that Jesus was a prophet, honored but limited, and that the Christian belief in his divinity was a form of association that contradicted the absolute unity of God. I had been taught that the crucifixion had not happened the way Christians described it, that God would not have allowed his prophet to die that way. But the man who had stood on the bow of my ship with those scars on his wrist had not been a prophet respectfully described in a chapter of a holy book. He had been someone else entirely, something else entirely. The gap between what I had been taught and what I had experienced was not a gap that intellectual argument could bridge. It was a gap that had been crossed by something that made intellectual argument feel like a very small instrument for a very large task. I began, during those days at sea, to pray differently. Not the structured prayers I had always known, with their precise timings and prescribed positions and formal Arabic language. Something more direct. Something more like an actual conversation with someone who was actually present. I had no language for this yet. I was feeling my way in the dark, reaching towards something I did not fully understand. But he was there. That is the only way I can say it. In those quiet early morning hours, when the ship was running smoothly and the watch was calm, there was a presence with me that had not been there before, quiet and steady and patient, waiting for me to catch up. When we arrived at our destination port and the cargo was discharged and the crew went on leave, I did something I had never done before. I did not book my flights home to Dubai immediately. Instead, I spent 3 days in my hotel room reading. I found an Arabic language New Testament on a Christian website that my phone could access through the port's internet connection. I read it the way I had learned to read navigation charts carefully and completely, paying attention to every detail. I read the Gospels. I read the accounts of his life and his teaching and his death and most importantly, his resurrection. I read about a man who had never once in his recorded words turned away anyone who came to him broken and compromised and carrying things they were ashamed of. A man who sat with exactly the kind of people that respectable religious society preferred not to acknowledge. I read the words he had spoken to people who were tangled up in corruption and self-justification and the comfortable habit of looking the other way. And what he said to them was not what I expected. He did not give them a list of reforms to implement. He did not offer them a graduated program of improvement. He said, "Follow me." Simple and complete and entirely demanding. Follow me. I understood for the first time what those words actually cost. To follow someone, they should truly follow them. You have to stop going where you were going. You have to turn around. You have to leave things behind that were never really serving you anyway, even though they felt like they were. By the time I flew home to Dubai, I had made a decision that I did not yet know how to act on, but that I was certain about. I was going to stop. I was going to stop sailing for the consortium. I was going to stop facilitating the movement of sanctioned oil revenues. I was going to stop telling myself that the distance between my hands and the consequences of my voyages was large enough to keep me innocent. And I was going to follow him, whatever that cost. Leaving the consortium was not as simple as handing in a resignation letter. Men like Walid Saban do not accept resignations graciously. The operations I had been part of for 8 years involved information that certain people would prefer to keep contained. I knew routes and contacts and financial arrangements that represented serious legal exposure for powerful individuals. A captain who decided to walk away from that kind of operation did not simply walk away. He became a question, and questions in that world have a limited number of acceptable answers. I told Walid that my health required me to take an extended leave from active sailing. This was partially true. The cardiology report from my last medical exam had flagged elevated blood pressure and recommended reduced stress. I used this as my opening. I told him I needed at least 6 months of the water to address the health concerns and that I would reassess at the end of that period. Walid accepted this with the smooth professionalism he applied to everything. He told me to take care of myself. He told me I was a valuable asset. He told me there would always be a command position waiting for me when I was ready to return. He smiled and said all the right things, and I smiled back and said all the right things, and we both knew that what was really being negotiated was not discussed out loud. I spent the first 3 months of my leave in Dubai. I continued reading the New Testament. I found an Arabic-speaking Christian pastor named Elias who led a small congregation of Arab believers in the city. Dubai has a significant expatriate Christian community, and the several churches operate openly there, which is different from many other countries in the region. I attended a service on a Sunday morning, sitting in the back row, and wearing ordinary clothes, feeling as conspicuous as a very large man trying to be invisible. Nobody treated me as conspicuous. That was the first thing I noticed. The congregation was made up of people from Lebanon, and Egypt and Jordan and other parts of the Arab world. They were professional people, ordinary people, people who had clearly lived complicated lives before arriving in that room. Nobody looked at me with assessment or suspicion. Nobody asked me to justify my presence. Pastor Elias preached that morning from a passage in the Gospel of John. He read about a night when the disciples were on a boat in a storm, terrified, and Jesus came to them walking on the water. He read about how Jesus got into the boat and the storm stopped immediately. I sat in the back row and felt tears running down my face that I did not bother to wipe away because I did not care anymore whether anyone saw them. This man knew about boats. He knew about the water at night. He knew about the moment when every instrument of human competence fails. And there is nothing left but the question of whether there is something beyond the instruments. He had been on that water with me. He had been on that water with frightened men in boats before I was born. He had always been on that water. After the service, I introduced myself to Pastor Elias. I told him only that I was a Saudi captain who had experienced something at sea that I needed to talk to someone about. He made time for me the following day. When I told him what had happened in the Strait of Hormuz, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said that Jesus has always been present in the places where people are most aware that they cannot save themselves. He said that the sea has always been one of those places. He said that what I had described was not unusual in the sense of being impossible. He said it was unusual in the sense of being a direct and specific response to a specific man in a specific situation, which is, he said, exactly how Jesus operates. He welcomed me. He prayed with me. He helped me take the step that I had been circling for months since the transit. I confessed my faith in Jesus Christ in that small office in Dubai, sitting across a desk from a Lebanese pastor with the noise of the city coming through the window. It was nothing like what I had imagined conversion would look like if I had ever imagined it at all. It was quiet and real and final in the way that only true things are final. In the months that followed, I worked through what I understood to be my obligations. I consulted with a legal advisor in the United Kingdom, a specialist in maritime law and international sanctions compliance, who was willing to discuss my situation confidentially. The consultation clarified what I had suspected. My participation in the consortium's operations over 8 years represented potential legal exposure across several jurisdictions. The question was not whether I had done things that were wrong. The question was what I was willing to do about it. I provided a detailed written account of the consortium's operations, the routes, the financial arrangements, the identity of key contacts to the appropriate international authorities through a formal legal process with immunity protections in place. I will not name the authorities or the process here because some of those proceedings are ongoing. What I will say is that I told the truth, all of it. The same way you tell the truth when you have stopped caring more about your own protection than about what is actually right. Walid found out, of course. The call came 3 weeks after I submitted my account. He did not shout. He spoke very quietly and very precisely and said things that I will not repeat here. I told him that I had made a choice and that I stood by it. He said that I had made a very serious mistake and that I should consider the implications for my safety. I said that I was aware of the implications and that I had made peace with them. He said one more thing and then the call ended. I moved from Dubai. I am not going to say where I went because my security situation remains something I have to be careful about. What I will say is that I am in a city where there is a good church and a good pastor and a community of people who know my story and who have shown me what it looks like to live honestly without the weight of compromise pressing down on everything you do. Bilal, the young crew member who came to find me on the bridge that night, left the consortium 6 months after I did. He reached out to me through a mutual contact. He told me that he had not been able to stop thinking about what he had seen on the bow of the Gulf Crescent. He told me that he had started reading about Jesus after the transit and that he wanted to talk. We spoke for several hours. He found his own way to faith in his own time and in his own manner. And his story is his to tell if he ever chooses to tell it. I think about my crew often, all 32 of them. I think about Hassan and the young Filipino engineer and the Egyptian cook who had been at sea since he was 17. They made it through that night safely, every one of them. I know because I checked. I tracked the voyage records and the crew manifests after I left the consortium. The Gulf Crescent completed her voyage without incident. All 32 men went home to their families. Not because of my navigation that night. Not because of my 30 years of experience or my Master Mariner certification or any instrument on that bridge. Because of who stood at the bow when everything I depended on was taken away from me. I think about my father as well. Nasser al-Zarani, who stood at the harbor in Jeddah and lifted a small boy up to see the big ships, and I told him that the men who commanded those ships were doing something that mattered. My father prayed faithfully every day of his adult life. He was a better man than his son turned out to be, by most measurements I can think of. He died before I entered the consortium's service, which I am grateful for in the way you are grateful for things that hurt. I do not know where my father is. I do not know what God's judgment looks like for a faithful Muslim man who never heard the full truth about Jesus in any form that reached him in the way it reached me on the bow of my ship. I leave that in the hands of a God whose mercy I have experienced firsthand and whose understanding of each human heart is so far beyond mine that comparison is not possible. What I know is what I experienced. What I know is who I saw. What I know is what he said to me and what he showed me and what he offered me and what it cost him to make that offer. And I know what I said in response. I said yes, and I have not regretted it for a single moment since. There is one more thing I want to say before I close. I want to say it directly and without softening it, because I am done with softening things. That way, if you are watching this and you are a Muslim man who has built your life on a foundation that you know somewhere underneath all the justifications, is not entirely clean. If you are a man who has made the kind of compromises that you tell yourself are necessary and practical and that everyone makes, if you are a man who prays faithfully and gives to charity and observes the practices of your faith while also doing things that you know are wrong but that you have found ways to not look at directly, I know who you are. I know who you are because I was you. I am telling you that there is a God who sees through every layer of justification you have ever constructed. I am telling you that He is not sitting at a distance watching with cold assessment. I am telling you that He came to a ship in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz at 2 a.m. and stood in the darkness so that one man who had been looking away for too long would finally look at Him directly. He will come to wherever you are. He does not require you to have sorted yourself out first. He does not require you to have cleaned up the record before you approach Him. He came to me in the middle of the mess. He will come to you in the middle of yours. His name is Jesus. And the scars on His wrists mean that the debt has already been paid. I am Faris al-Zahrani. I am a Saudi ship captain. I sailed for 30 years through the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. And the most important thing that ever happened to me on the water was the night Jesus stood on the bow of my ship and called me by my name. If this testimony has reached something in you, write in the comments, He stood on the bow for me too. Let it be the beginning of your own voyage home.